This is Telling It Like It Is, our weekly look at the stories making the headlines, as discussed by the broadcaster and journalist James Delingpole and the former Kremlin advisor and editor of StirringTroubleInternationally.com. That's Alexander Nekrassov. Gents, the scandal surrounding the affair of President Hollande with the actress Julie Gaillet has taken an unusual twist. Alexander, what do you think?
I think it's an exciting story for the French because they actually pretend that they don't care what their leaders do when they do care. I've heard that the Closer magazine has sold out already 3 issues. It's a funny story because obviously Hollande is in trouble with everything, economy, foreign policy, everything. And suddenly he gets into this mess. And the press conference in the palace, what was the joke? To be honest with you,
he was confronted once by the first questioner, actually, who said, "What's the story and who's the first lady?" and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but the whole point was that people were sitting there wanting to talk about that alone and nothing else, and of course all the bureaucrats were pretending that no, they want to talk about issues. They don't want serious ones, not the.
So it has to be a bad state of affairs when the French economy, is a better thing to talk about than your private life. James, what did you make of the stories of his wearing a helmet and riding around on a scooter and all that kind of stuff? As a passenger and enjoying croissants with his new love.
Well, Brendan, I would have thought that he ought to be really grateful for this distraction from his disastrous economic performance. He ought to be paying money to that French magazine for taking the heat off his appalling political record. Normally in France, it's considered a badge of honour, isn't it, to have a mistress. The French always congratulate themselves on their enlightened attitude towards relationships, and it's considered acceptable that a man has his wife and then he has his bit on the side.
Yeah, but that one doesn't even have a wife. He's got the first lady, who is his girlfriend. Now, what he could have done is create a post called The First Mistress. Now then, it would have fitted perfectly into the French arrangement. So he has the first lady and he has the first mistress.
It's a labyrinthine arrangement because the mother of his children is in fact Ségolène Royal. Curiouser, James.
I think none of this would be gaining any traction if he were in any way a popular leader. If the economy wasn't tanking in France, then I think the French would be going, "Oh la la, this is wonderful. President, he is continuing the French tradition." Obviously, he's not at the moment. He's being even more useless than most French presidents, and so he's in trouble.
Another divisive leader, former leader Ariel Sharon, he was buried in Israel. Divisive among the international community, let's face it. Most people in Israel seem to have been pouring their tributes as the father of the nation and all that kind of stuff. What did you make of all of this, Alexander? I mean, he suffered a stroke and he's been in a coma for 8 years.
What I found obviously ridiculous was that Tony Blair was there praising him. And also Joe Biden was there saying that he was a complex person in a complex environment with complex neighbors and so on, sort of hinting that America had a bit of a problem with him. I still think it was bizarre in the sense that a man who was dead for 8 years was suddenly buried with all honors. And I think that the Americans didn't really know what to do about it because they're in a mess, aren't they? We have John Kerry being called by the Israeli defense minister sort of trying to look like a messiah and getting obsessed with that peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And it is strange, by the way, that Israel and Palestinians, they don't really have a war at the moment or anything. When we have a situation, I mean, the whole Middle East is aflame. In Iraq, we have a war. Gentlemen, we have a war. It's official. And no one travels to Iraq from America, or maybe some low-key military people, and they're also saying, yeah, we're supplying some arms to them. But this is the result of the Iraqi war. And all the trouble that we see in the Middle East is the result of the Iraqi war. So for Americans to suddenly switch their targets and go for peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which will not work, everybody knows that. And that all seems so bizarre.
And James, I mean, Ariel Sharon, it's really a nation grieving, I suppose. But what did you make of it all?
I think take slight issue with Alexander's claim that all the troubles in the Middle East are the result of the Iraq War. I think it has been going on a bit longer than that. But Ariel Sharon has been given an awful lot of stick in the left liberal media because of the Sabra and Chechila massacres, and there is no doubt that Sharon was a brutally efficient, impetuous military leader. But I think what people sometimes are inclined to forget is if you live in Israel, you are surrounded on all your borders by enemies committed to wiping you off the map. You need people like Ariel Sharon, and he really showed his mettle in 1967 and again in 1973. He was one of the leaders, one of the military commanders who helped save Israel. And I think it's understandable that Israel should be grateful for that. And of course, there was the other matter as well, where because he was a hard man, he was able to make negotiations with the Palestinians, which might have been impossible for a dove. So I think, yes, of course, I understand Biden's point about him trying to sort of not be rude about him, but trying to find something nice to say. We outsiders, I don't think, are in a position to judge what it is like being an Israeli surrounded by enemies, and I think for Israelis, Sharon was a total hero.
Speaking of Joe Biden, he was certainly on the receiving end of some criticism in the memoir by Robert Gates. His new memoir lays both into Joe Biden, also Barack Obama in Afghanistan. He didn't have a good word to say about anyone, really, Alexander. First of all, we can talk about the memoir, and also what he said about British forces we can touch on as well. But first of all, just on the memoir and his criticism of Barack Obama, he is a relatively bipartisan figure who is quite embittered.
Well, first of all, let's not forget that he was a Republican in a Democrat administration, which was odd, by the way. And also, I think he was bitter because when Obama came to power, I think the mood has changed in Washington in the sense that suddenly they were talking about withdrawing troops as quickly as possible from all over the place, and Robert Gates was not some dove who would welcome that. So bitterness not only sells books, but I think he really was bitter about the whole situation. And as regards him saying that the British are not going to play the same role as they played before because they don't invest into the military forces. Well, yes, he's right in one sense. On the other hand, Britain is not really a superpower anymore. I think that the British foreign policy is so confused at the moment because they sort of want to start a war, but they can't start a war because they don't have enough troops for that. They're sort of pulling out of Afghanistan and saying that it's a heroic disengagement, that they're just pulling out in an orderly fashion when everybody knows that they are retreating. And the worst scenario, by the way, is that they will have to fight their way out of Afghanistan along with the NATO troops. In this respect, I think he's right in one sense, but he's saying something that we've known.
And actually, James, I guess a lot of people in Britain would be nodding their heads in agreement. He says that Barack Obama is indecisive. He was indecisive in Afghanistan. It was an inherited conflict he didn't want.
Oh, I think Barack Obama has been absolutely useless on foreign policy. I think it's extraordinary that he got given the Nobel Peace Prize when he's done nothing to promote peace in the world. He's just weakened America's role as a kind of peacemaker. And I think that does not redound to his credit. I love Gates' attack on Joe Biden. Wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. You can't get more damning than that. Biden is I suppose, the American equivalent of somebody like John Prescott. Do you remember when he was Deputy Prime Minister? It's extraordinary that we have a political system where major world powers are capable of electing as their number 2 complete idiots. Gates' account of what it's like in the White House, by far the most centralized and controlling in national security of any I had seen since Richard Nixon. And he said key players in the Obama White House were suspicious and sometimes condescending and insulting towards the military. Obama can be nice towards the military when it suits him, as, for example, when they boost his credit ratings by offing Osama bin Laden. But generally, he has not been the military's friend. He has not been America's friend in terms of foreign policy, no.
And staying in the US, in America, the possible Republican contender for the US presidency in 2016, Alexander, that's the New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. He's been on the defensive, hasn't he? Dragged into two scandals at once.
Well, it was quite amazing to see how the American media sort of made a huge scandal out of this lane closures. To be honest with you, it was quite bizarre to see some of the hacks basically comparing it to Watergate or something. And I think that Chris Christie was a strong contender. I personally don't like him very much. I think he's a sort of all things to all man. But what it shows is that he's got absolutely no proper machine in his administration. I don't know how he was planning to become a presidential nominee. And I think that they handled it badly, and especially the second so-called scandal, when he was accused of using federal money to promote himself during the aftermath of the Sandy hurricane. And that basically was taken out of nowhere, and it's not really an issue, to be honest. But the way he is responding to these scandals, I'm starting to have my doubts that he has any chance at all of going through a nomination campaign. I'm now starting to think we should look elsewhere for a potential presidential candidate.
The presidential campaign's getting dirty already, James.
Chris Christie was looking like a very strong contender for the Republican ticket in 2016. He is pretty much a centrist, and we saw that in the way that he cozied up to Obama in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, which I don't think really reflected well on him. I'm not a Chris Christie fan either, but it's interesting. If this is what the US liberal media does to a centrist potential Republican candidate, imagine what they're going to do who shows any kind of right-wing balls.
Now, staying stateside, that big awards ceremony, the Golden Globes, has announced its winners. Did you see the awards, Alexander, and what did you think of 12 Years a Slave being named Best Film of the Past Year? A British film, actually, effectively, or directed by a Brit.
Yes. Well, the thing is that the Golden Globes have become pathetic. I'm sorry, but everything starting from the selection of the films and to the speeches that are made, and even the director of the film, 12 Years a Slave, came out and said he never expected that film.
Steve McQueen.
Steve McQueen, yes. That film to get any awards. Well, I don't think so. I think the subject was chosen very carefully by Steve McQueen, and I think that he knew perfectly well that he's playing to the American liberal audiences. As regards films about slavery, they seem to be popular at the moment. I think that, it's time for somebody to make a film and show us more about slavery than just, the black people suffering and the white people beating them up and torturing them, because it's not such a one-sided situation. Also, I think what nobody knows, I suspect, about slavery generally, is that Russia was the only country in the world that abandoned slavery and gave the serfs land so that they could actually survive and they could actually build their lives. Whereas in America, when slavery was abolished, the slaves were basically told, that's it, guys, you are free now. And what happened? Immediately they were enslaved by all sorts of dodgy lenders and by owners of factories who needed this cheap labor. And it's not a one-sided issue, even if you consider that the slave runners and the middlemen were not white people. They were actually Africans and Arabs. So even these are important things that are never mentioned. And I think that this is why, and Golden Globes obviously have everything to do with promoting liberal films. The whole ceremony is embarrassing. And if you look at the speeches, my position on this is this. Let's all boycott films which get these awards.
Now, 12 Years a Slave, probably not a good first date film, but James, I'm wondering, what did you make of it? Did it deserve the plaudits that it got?
I don't think we should boycott this event. I think the time has come for Alexander and I to make a film for next year's Golden Globes / Oscars called Slavery is Really, Really, Really Bad, okay? Because it's obviously a theme that carries a lot of play with American liberal audiences. I saw that on Twitter, Piers Morgan, my least favourite man in the world, was tweeting about how how moved he had been, how shaken he had been by the atrocities he had seen in this awful, harrowing film. Well, I'm sure. By the way, he wasn't 12 years a slave. He was only 11 years a slave. So it's been subject to inflation. But putting that aside for a moment, look, we can all wring our hands about terrible things that have happened in the past. We could make a film about the things that Attila the Hun did. We know bad things happen in history. But there's something slightly nauseating about the liberal response to this film, which is as if they're suddenly discovering that slavery was really unfair and really brutal. We know that. And by the way, we also know who it was who ended the slave trade. It was a British conservative named William Wilberforce.
Of course, yes. I just actually want to get your quick view on the Scorsese film, The Wolf of Wall Street. Probably not a liberal film, but 506 uses of the F word. Alexander, too many?
I have never been a fan of Scorsese films. I can't understand what the hype is all about. They promote violence and gangland sort of culture, as it's called now, Goodfellas and all that. Taxi Driver was appalling film. And obviously, every time he makes a film, he actually goes on the defensive immediately, like he did now, when he was saying, no, I'm not promoting or glamorizing excess and debauchery in the financial sector. But he's exactly doing that. And guess what? He's putting in 506 F words, and immediately the British Board of Classification of Films relaxes the rules for children to watch films with a lot of swearing in them, which was quite odd for me.
What about the excesses of banking this side of the pond? James, the Labour Party has urged George Osborne to block any attempt by Royal Bank of Scotland to pay bonuses of up to double its bankers' annual salaries. What do you make of this? Is this a good move by Labour?
Look, in theory, I am all for people in the free market getting paid bonuses. I believe that companies should be allowed to decide how much their employees are paid. Unfortunately, this is not a free market. This is a completely rigged market. We've spent millions bailing out these various banks, which there was a deeply corrupt relationship between banksters, as I call them, and the politicians and the corporatists. It's a complete stitch up between the lot of them. I don't honestly think that Labour and the Conservatives have any credibility on this issue whatsoever. The whole thing is a ghastly mess.
And the thing that few people realize is that the Royal Bank of Scotland at the moment, its value is much less still than the money which was spent by the taxpayers to bail it out. There was a moment when they were playing with the idea of privatizing it back, but now not a word is being said. This is first point. Second point, George Osborne is the chief executive of RBS, in a sense that the 80% belong to the government, to the taxpayers. So for him to be now, trying to look strong and fair play and so on, they blew it. The Treasury blew it with RBS, and they have to take the responsibility. So they can talk about an economic recovery, and for some strange reason, the inflation rate dropping down to 2%, which, by the way, the reason was beautiful. I found it extraordinary that it was due to the slowdown in the rise of prices on fruit. Now, even in North Korea, they do better than that. They find some better explanation.
How do you reckon they did rig it? Because I agree, it totally stinks, this very convenient 2% figure.
No, they just don't care anymore. They just put this any figure, and who is going to check it? This is the Office of National Statistics. This is the agency that is funded by the government. Now, guess what it's going to say. This is the Office of National Statistics that has been covering up Labour's incompetence for 13 years in power.
In a week when Ed Miliband will be addressing, he'll be making a keynote address. He's declared himself effectively the saviour of the middle classes. He wrote in the Daily Telegraph this week that the foundations of middle-class life are being undermined by affordable housing, a lack of affordable housing, lack of well-paid jobs, and he'll probably use this RBS banking story to bolster his credentials, James.
I have some very, very small sympathy with Ed Miliband over this point, for example, about he was trying to make big play of the cost of living crisis. And I think that the cost of living crisis genuinely exists. I think it's a real problem. The fact that while the asset rich are getting their assets inflated by all this money printing and now this new help to buy scheme of the governments, while everyone else is getting poorer and poorer and finding it a bigger struggle. The problem is, with Ed Miliband's thesis, is that the reason we're having this cost of living crisis is precisely because of politics pursued by glib politicians like him and David Cameron, and I really don't differentiate much between them. They're all part of the same problem. They've all been expanding the state far beyond its natural size, which means that you've got this massive welfare system which we're having to pay for somehow. Largely, it seems to me, by borrowing more and more money. We're borrowing £100 billion a year, not doing much to get rid of this deficit. It's clear that if Miliband were to gain power, he would be certainly no better and probably a bit worse than David Cameron. So a plague on all their houses, I say.
And he's got a problem, Alexander, because this week an ICM poll showed that he's lost 3 points in the polls. He's less popular than he was. He's not quite winning this argument about the squeezed middle.
Well, it's very difficult to believe at Miliband because he's trying to do a Tony Blair, basically. That's what Tony Blair did. He tried to appeal to a wider audience and come across as some sort of a savior of the middle classes as well. That didn't work out well. And it's not working for Ed Miliband. The problem is, of course, that although 3 years have passed since the Labour government has collapsed, and people still remember what Labour did in power, people still remember all those vast amounts of money being squandered on public services, which didn't really push them up in quality. And I don't think that he'll be trusted because however he tries to distance himself from the new Labour, it's not going well for him. And another thing, let's not forget that the media in Britain has sided with Cameron. I mean, so crystal clear, this attempt by most of the newspapers to present the current mess, and I've stressed it's a mess in the economy, as if it's wonderful policies of the coalition, Tory part of the coalition government. I sometimes wonder where these people, those business commentators, live, on what planet, because what they're saying goes against logic. And all these stats that are being thrown at the public and being discussed very seriously by all these commentators, it's just a joke.
Alexander can see this very clearly because he's known an era when the Soviet era when the media was totally controlled by a corrupt and all powerful system. But I'm astonished when I open my papers, and you're right, they're all singing from the same hymn sheet. They've clearly decided, for better or worse, Cameron is the man to win the next general election, for all his faults. And they will say anything. They will say anything about they will go along with this joke referendum that he's promising, which will carry no weight and is completely unviable, this 2017 promise. And yet all the media has fallen into line unquestioningly. The story about the growing economy, about the inflation, this magical inflation fall.
But on that Europe point, though, I mean, George Osborne reiterated the position on Britain's place in the EU, for instance, saying that it needs to reform or decline. That sounds like an ultimatum. That might play quite well in the electorate.
Yes. Politically, it might play quite well for people who know nothing about how the European Union is constructed. They're promising a deal which they cannot possibly follow through, which is to say that under Article 50 of the European Union Treaty, if you want to renegotiate your treaty, you must first announce your intention to leave. You don't do it the other way. You don't say you make a few changes to your system first, and we'll look at what's on the table, and then we'll make up our minds. This is not how the European works. It's extremely arrogant that we in Britain imagine that we can just high-handedly declare what our arrangement is, whereas the fact is that under the European Union's labyrinthine arrangements, once you've surrendered various aspects of your sovereignty, you cannot regain it.
And don't forget that the reason why they're saying all this tough talk on Europe is because they're terrified of UKIP. And
Yes.
that's why they need to neutralize UKIP and see to it that they don't win too many seats in the European Parliament in May, because that will damage them. But I personally think that with the help of the media, Cameron will win. I don't see any big sort of future for UKIP because they are a strange party. And unfortunately, there might be even again a coalition between the Tories and the Lib Dems, and they will stay for another 5 years. And of course, there won't be any referendum in a proper way in Europe. It will be a joke.
Welfare will be a key part of that election, and I'm just wondering, I'm sure, James, you've been watching Channel 4 show Benefit Street. It sparked
Yes.
a lot of controversy. The poor old residents of James Turner Street feel that they've been unfairly portrayed.
Interesting use of the word unfair. 90% of the residents of that street are on welfare in some shape or form. Therefore, the idea that they've been misrepresented as a bunch of scroungers seems to me to be protesting a little too much. Of course, the left liberal media loathes Benefits Britain being exposed in this way. But I think a lot of people are looking at this thing and saying, well, hang on a second, I'm really struggling to pay off all my bills. I work really hard. And here I am helping these feckless scroungers to sit on their doorstep, boosting their suntans. I think that this is not before time, and I'm very glad that Channel 4 has shone a light on this.
So it's a bit of this electioneering again. You would see in the next 12 months, British establishment and even the liberal media becoming right-wing in a sense. You would see that happening because what everybody is always forgetting, that Britain is a conservative country in its core, and whatever the BBC might think or say, and whatever the Guardian might write, this is how it is. And every time we approach an election, all politicians start to become right-wing all of a sudden, which basically proves that they know perfectly well that the conservative thinking sort of majority is there, and that's how they need to do it. The moment they win, they become liberal, left-wing at once, because they don't care anymore. And that's why I think this film is, again, a bit of a propaganda, to be honest, on the part of Channel 4, which is also supporting, by the way, Cameron.
Speaking of conservative sentiment, just quickly before we finish, there was a private member's bill put forward by Peter Bone MP to rename the August bank holiday as Margaret Thatcher Day. James, do you think this is a good idea?
I don't think having national days named after people is a particularly good idea. I love Margaret Thatcher. I think that she was the best Conservative Prime Minister of the last century. But yeah, calling it a national day after her seems to me provocative. It's what foreign countries do. It's not British.
And maybe Winston Churchill would be a better candidate for that anyway, Alexander.
He might be, and they also should take down that strange-looking cockerel on Trafalgar Square and maybe put a monument to Thatcher there instead of these days, because these days smack of North Korea and China. Of communist things, that when they love to make days, national days in honor of their leaders.
And speaking of immortalising politicians, what about the bill for painting politicians? One of them was Diane Abbott. The bill extends to hundreds of thousands of pounds. James, what did you think of the paintings from an aesthetic point of view? And is that money well spent, in your view?
I would certainly pay lots of money to paint Diane Abbott. I'd paint her.
I thought it was a wonderful portrait.
Yellow gloss would look really
James,
good.
did you see the portrait of Diane Abbott? I thought it was great.
What about the one of Tony Blair?
It says everything.
The cheapest one was actually Tony Blair's portrait. I think it was worth about £8,000.
Well, Tony Blair, I think it was a good portrait in the sense that it showed all his sins on his face. So it says everything about the man.
It's the Dorian Gray picture.
Stays up in the attic. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, gents. Telling it like it is, our weekly look at the stories making the headlines, as discussed by the broadcaster and journalist James Delingpole and the former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov. My name is Brendan Cole.